Ho ho ho! Merry Christmas, boys and girls! Today, I'm going to give you a special gift. Information about the formation of contracts under the Uniform Commercial Code. Let's get started. UCC Article 2, Part 2, Form, Formation, and Readjustment of Contract. Section 2201. Formal Requirements, Statute of Frauds. 1. A contract for the sale of goods for the price of $5,000 or more is not enforceable by way of action or defense unless there is some record sufficient to indicate that a contract for sale has been made between the parties and signed by the party against which enforcement is sought or by the party's authorized agent or broker. A record is not insufficient because it omits or incorrectly states a term agreed upon, but the contract is not enforceable under this subsection beyond the quantity of goods showed in the record. 2. Between merchants, if within a reasonable time a record in confirmation of the contract and sufficient against the sender is received, and the party receiving it has reason to know its contents, it satisfies the requirements of subsection 1 against the recipient unless notice of objection to its contents is given in a record within 10 days after it is received. 3. A contract that does not satisfy the requirements of subsection 1, but which is valid in other respects, is enforceable. A. If the goods are to be specially manufactured for the buyer and are not suitable for sale to others in the ordinary course of the seller's business, and the seller, before notice of repudiation is received and under circumstances that reasonably indicate that the goods are for the buyer, has made either a substantial beginning of their manufacture or commitments for their procurement. B. If the party against which enforcement is sought admits in the party's pleading or in the party's testimony or otherwise under oath that a contract for sale was made, but the contract is not enforceable under this paragraph beyond the quantity of goods admitted. Or C. With respect to goods for which payment has been made and accepted or which have been received and accepted. Section 2606. 4. A contract that is enforceable under this section is not unenforceable merely because it is not capable of being performed within 1 year or any other period after its making. Section 2202. Final expression in a record, parole or extrinsic evidence. 1. Terms with respect to which the confirmatory records of the parties agree or which are otherwise set forth in a record intended by the parties as a final expression of their agreement with respect to such terms as are included therein may not be contradicted by evidence of any prior agreement or of a contemporaneous oral agreement, but may be supplemented by evidence of A. Course of performance, course of dealing, or usage of trade, Section 1303, and B. Consistent additional terms unless the court finds the record to have been intended also as a complete and exclusive statement of the terms of the agreement. 2. Terms in a record may be explained by evidence of course of performance, course of dealing, or usage of trade without a preliminary determination by the court that the language used is ambiguous. Section 2203. Seals inoperative. The affixing of a seal to a record evidencing a contract for sale or an offer to buy or sell goods does not constitute the record a sealed instrument. The law with respect to sealed instruments does not apply to such a contract or offer. Section 2204. Formation in general. 1. A contract for sale of goods may be made in any manner sufficient to show agreement, including offer and acceptance, conduct by both parties which recognizes the existence of a contract, the interaction of electronic agents, and the interaction of an electronic agent and an individual. 2. An agreement sufficient to constitute a contract for sale may be found, even if the moment of its making is undetermined. 3. Even if one or more terms are left open, a contract for sale does not fail for indefiniteness if the parties have intended to make a contract and there is a reasonably certain basis for giving an appropriate remedy. 4. Except as otherwise provided in sections 2.211 through 2.213, the following rules apply. A. A contract may be formed by the interaction of electronic agents of the parties, even if no individual was aware of or reviewed the electronic agent's actions or the resulting terms and agreements. B. A contract may be formed by the interaction of an electronic agent and an individual acting on the individual's own behalf or for another person. A contract is formed if the individual takes actions that the individual is free to refuse to take or makes a statement, and the individual has reason to know that the actions or statement will 1. Cause the electronic agent to complete the transaction or performance, or 2. Indicate acceptance of an offer, regardless of other expressions or actions by the individual to which the electronic agent cannot react. Section 2205. Firm offers. An offer by a merchant to buy or sell goods in a signed record that by its terms gives assurance that it will be held open is not revocable for lack of consideration during the time stated, or if no time is stated for a reasonable time, but in no event may such period of irrevocability exceed 3 months, but in no event may the period of irrevocability exceed 3 months. Any such term of assurance in a form supplied by the offeree must be separately signed by the offeror. Section 2206. Offer and acceptance in formation of contract. 1. Unless otherwise unambiguously indicated by the language or circumstances, A. An offer to make a contract shall be construed as inviting acceptance in any manner and by any medium reasonable in the circumstances. B. An order or other offer to buy goods for prompt or current shipment shall be construed as inviting acceptance either by a prompt promise to ship or by the prompt or current shipment of conforming or non-conforming goods, but the shipment of non-conforming goods is not an acceptance if the seller seasonably notifies the buyer that the shipment is offered only as an accommodation to the buyer. 2. If the beginning of a requested performance is a reasonable mode of acceptance, an offeror that is not notified of acceptance within a reasonable time may treat the offer as having lapsed before acceptance. 3. A definite and seasonable expression of acceptance in a record operates as an acceptance even if it contains terms additional to or different from the offer. Ho ho ho! Isn't this fun, kids? Now, pay attention. This next one is a doozy. We call this one the Battle of the Forms. Section 2207. Terms of contract. Effect of confirmation. Subject to Section 2202, if 1. Conduct by both parties recognizes the existence of a contract, although their records do not otherwise establish a contract. 2. A contract is formed by an offer and acceptance. Or 3. A contract formed in any manner is confirmed by a record that contains terms additional to or different from those in the contract being confirmed. The terms of the contract are A. Terms that appear in the records of both parties. B. Terms, whether in a record or not, to which both parties agree. And C. Terms supplied or incorporated under any provision of this Act. Section 2208. Reserved. Oh, that one's boring. I'm sorry, kids, but there's no substance there. Section 2209. Modification, rescission, and waiver. 1. An agreement modifying a contract within this article needs no consideration to be binding. 2. An agreement in a signed record which excludes modification or rescission, except by a signed record, may not be otherwise modified or rescinded, but except as between merchants, such a requirement in a form supplied by the merchant must be separately signed by the other party. 3. The requirements of Section 2201 must be satisfied if the contract, as modified, is within its provisions. 4. Although an attempt at modification or rescission does not satisfy the requirements of subsection 2 or 3, it may operate as a waiver. 5. A party that has made a waiver affecting an executory portion of a contract may retract the waiver by reasonable notification received by the other party that strict performance will be required of any term waived, unless the retraction would be unjust in view of a material change of position in reliance on the waiver. So you see, kids, if you're trying to issue a waiver to someone you're in a contract with, make sure you're not being naughty. Section 2210. Delegation of performance. Assignment of rights. 1. If the seller or buyer assigns rights under a contract, the following rules apply. A. Subject to paragraph B and except as otherwise provided in Section 9406, or as otherwise agreed, all rights of the seller or the buyer may be assigned unless the assignment would materially change the duty of the other party, increase materially the burden or risk imposed on that party by the contract, or impair materially that party's chance of obtaining return performance. A right to damages for breach of the whole contract, or a right arising out of the assignor's due performance of its entire obligation may be assigned despite an agreement otherwise. B. The creation, attachment, perfection, or enforcement of a security interest in the seller's interest under a contract is not an assignment that materially changes the duty of or materially increases the burden or risk imposed on the buyer or materially impairs the buyer's chance of obtaining return performance under paragraph A unless and only to the extent that enforcement of the security interest results in a delegation of a material performance of the seller. Even in that event, the creation, attachment, perfection, and enforcement of the security interest remains effective. However, the seller is liable to the buyer for damages caused by the delegation to the extent that the damages could not reasonably be prevented by the buyer, and a court may grant other appropriate relief, including cancellation of the contract or an injunction against enforcement of the security interest or consummation of the enforcement. 2. If the seller or buyer delegates performance of its duties under a contract, the following rules apply. A. A party may perform its duties through a delegate unless otherwise agreed or unless the other party has a substantial interest in having the original promise or perform or control the acts required by the contract. Delegation of performance does not relieve the delegating party of any duty to perform or liability for breach. B. Acceptance of a delegation of duties by the assignee constitutes a promise to perform those duties. The promise is enforceable by either the assignor or the other party to the original contract. C. The other party may treat any delegation of duties as creating reasonable grounds for insecurity and may, without prejudice to its rights against the assignor, demand assurances from the assignee under Section 2609. D. A contractual term prohibiting the delegation of duties otherwise delegable under paragraph A is enforceable and an attempted delegation is not effective. 3. An assignment of the contract or of all my rights under the contract or an assignment in similar general terms is an assignment of rights, and unless the language or the circumstances, as in an assignment for security, indicate the contrary, it is also a delegation of performance of the duties of the assignor. 4. Unless the circumstances indicate the contrary, a prohibition of assignment of the contract is to be construed as barring only the delegation to the assignee of the assignor's performance. Section 2.2.11 Legal recognition of electronic contracts, records, and signatures. 1. A record or signature may not be denied legal effect or enforceability solely because it is in electronic form. 2. A contract may not be denied legal effect or enforceability solely because an electronic record was used in its formation. 3. This article does not require a record or signature to be created, generated, sent, communicated, received, stored, or otherwise processed by electronic means or in electronic form. 4. A contract formed by the interaction of an individual and an electronic agent under Section 2.204(4)b does not include terms provided by the individual if the individual had reason to know that the agent could not react to the terms as provided. Section 2.212 Attribution. An electronic record or electronic signature is attributable to a person if it was the act of the person or the person's electronic agent, or the person is otherwise legally bound by the act. And finally, Section 2.213 Electronic Communication. 1. If the receipt of an electronic communication has a legal effect, it has that effect even if no individual is aware of its receipt. 2. Receipt of an electronic acknowledgement of an electronic communication establishes that the communication was received, but, in itself, does not establish that the content sent corresponds to the content received. Now, wasn't that exciting, boys and girls? Ho, 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 ho. I know it sure was exciting to me. So, join me again next Christmas, when I deliver you more information about the Uniform Commercial Code. I think I'll maybe give you information on investment securities. Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas!